Rightio, back with my electric over hydraulic disc brakes, where I've converted from electric drums to electric over hydraulic disc. Now I'm at the stage where I've actually run all the brake lines, but now I guess I should need to talk to you about what the process was and what it required, so you know what you need or how to go about it when it comes to doing yours if you do choose to go down this line. Now the first thing you've got to think about is where you're going to run the brake lines, and what material or what items you're going to use to support it, what type of brake lines you're going to use, lengths, and all that sort of things along those lines. So one of the things you've got to really think about when you're running the brake lines on your trailer is rock strike. These things get hammered by rocks from your tug vehicle on the front, obviously pulling the van, and whatever else gets flung around with the tyres in the wheel arch. So in planning that, in thinking about that, I should say, you've got to plan your layout for your hoses. So I guess we've got to talk about hose first off. What are you going to use and how do you go about it? Now, there's several ways you can do it. You can probably pull up to some place that makes brake hoses for you and just get them to do it. Hey, a hell of a lot easier, but it's probably going to cost you around the $500 to $1,000 mark in parts and labor to do that itself. So okay, you can DIY some of this stuff. You can buy, the cheapest way to do it is buy some hard line and a flaring tool, and go from there and make a combination of hard lines and rubber lines. Now you're still going to need to get someone to either crimp them or make the lines for you. I did find online on a lot of the trailer places, they have pre-made brake lines, so you can purchase them after you measure out what you need. Not going to be the neatest and tidiest way, but it's probably a fairly safe way if you're not very familiar with lines and how to run them and how to actually put fittings on. So I decided to go along the lines of the 200 series ProFlow-3 steel braided Teflon lined or Teflon tubed hose. Now this is quite an economical way to do it. I do suggest you sit down with a catalogue or print out the catalogue with what fittings you need, and you need to know about fittings too, because this is all what they call -3 or AN-3 fittings. And this line is what they call 3/16 line. It's a 1/4 inch or 6.7 mil roughly on the outside diameter. So that's going to determine what sort of clamps you use to support the hose with, and obviously your fittings. So you're going to be using all -3 fittings, and then whether you're using JIC or inverted flare and whatnot to do your actual hose install. Now, talking a little about this hose, this is quite easy but painful to work with. If you cut it, the steel braid will all flare out and end up stuck in your fingers. So when you do go to cut it, you just wrap it in some masking tape, and then you can put a pen mark on there, work out where you're going to mark it, and then use a sharp pair of side cutters or a set of balustrade wire cutters, or even an angle grinder with a thin cut-off wheel. Just make sure you clean the debris out of the hose once you've done with that. Sometimes the angle grinder can cause the wire to flare up as you cut through it, but if you cut through it steady, it seems to be okay. I choose to use a pair of balustrade wire cutters just to make it a lot easier. All you got to do is, once you cut it with a pair of side cutters or balustrade wire cutters, is you've got to resize a hose. But there's videos on how to make the hose, so I'm not going to go down that line of showing you how to do that. But just to be aware that there is a couple of different companies that sell these things. There's ProFlow and Aeroflow. I had to use both to get the fittings that are required. Some couldn't supply them from one company, couldn't supply some for months. The other one had no issues with it, but I wanted to use stainless steel all the way, but the fittings for stainless were sort of a bit hit and miss in availability, so I've used a combination of stainless and steel. It's not really no biggie. I mean, look, you think about your car, it's all steel fittings in your car. They are zinc plated, so they're not going to rust in any time soon. And with Aeroflow, or with ProFlow I should say, I found their steel fittings were the same price as the stainless steel, which is bloody expensive. Most of these fittings are around, in stainless, around $27 to $40. So it does start to add up. So I think in grand total, with the extra fittings I ordered because I wasn't quite 100% sure about how I was going to run the hoses, I probably spent nearly $500 in fittings and hose. So it does start to add up. Next thing, I also purchased some 7.4mm inside diameter black PVC tube to cover the hose in, and then I also got some 9.5 inside diameter PVC tube to go just to double up the thickness, so that 9.5 slid over the 7.4. Not a problem, just to give it a bit more thickness to protect the hose from rock strike. Now, another thing about this hose is it doesn't like to flex a lot, so you've got to really take that into consideration when you run these hoses, is how the hose is flexing. You've got to make sure it flexes in the loop, not at the back of the fitting, because it'll end up breaking. The wire just works hard and then breaks, and then it blows out, and then you've got no brakes. So I've tried to do the best job I can. I've got some cushion or rubber lined P-clamps. I drilled and tapped the places in the chassis or the axle front and the axle housing where I needed to put P-clamps to support the hose, and in the areas where it's likely to get a lot of rock strike, I put the double layers of PVC tube over the hose. So you can see here where it's got one layer. Hopefully it shouldn't get too damaged there, but then when I brought it around onto the brake caliper, I've done that. Now I've changed the inverted flare fitting on the back of the brake caliper to a banjo fitting, which meant I had to buy new copper washers to do that, and that's why I spoke about the banjo fitting in the previous video, because there's different thickness banjos, and which means different lengths bolts. So just something to be wary of. This is originally where the actual electrical wiring ran anyway, and it hadn't been damaged, so I figured I'll just run with the same thing and just make it a little bit better. The other thing you got to allow for is your caliper to move, and also be able to pull your caliper off without having to disconnect your brake lines. Now I'll have to undo this P-clamp here to get the caliper out of the way, but there's enough length there to, once I do that, to remove the caliper so I can get the disc rotor off. So as I said, there's a layout. You've got to think about where you're going to mount your electric over hydraulic actuator. Now mine's mounted up in front of the wheel arch here in a storage box, so that meant I had to think about where the wiring's going to run, how I'm going to get the wiring there. I did want to run the wiring internally in the van, but I just didn't have the room because of all the other excess wiring. I didn't really feel like drilling a heap of more holes because just how the wiring runs in the van. So I actually ran another wire down the chassis rail and actually brought it up through the floor, oops, just see through here, and used a dash-free bulkhead for the floor, which is sealed nicely, so that should stop all the dust and dirt. I'm going to put a stainless steel plate over here just to stop any of the rock strike damaging where that enters through the floor of the van. I've used the T-piece up here, which I've then chassis mounted, and then the other hose, this other end of the hose disappears over the other side, and then is zip tied across the that floor support or cross member, you want to call it, that's holding the underside of the van. And hopefully everything should run pretty good and my fittings won't leak after I've made them. Now the handbrake cable is another thing I need to talk about. This was a bit of a pain. I ended up using a swageless fitting and a eye bolt through the lever, just because if you wrap the cable around the lever and then used a cable saddle to put it in place, you had to get it really tight on there, and you could flick the cable up over this and actually get it to pull out. I don't think it would probably fall out under normal operation, but I thought, well, I'll go the extra distance and just make things a little bit neater. Then I continued on. I had to put another eye bolt here to get the cable just pulling on not such a big angle, otherwise it pulled up on such a large angle that it didn't want to really pulling the lever properly. So hopefully this all works. I haven't got the other side quite finished yet. I'm waiting for a couple of eyelets, wire cable eyelets to support where the cable runs underneath the chassis rail there a bit so it doesn't drag. The other thing I've done is I ran the breakaway switch wiring out to the front of the drawbar, which I don't need a breakaway switch on my van because it's not over not at the legal weight requirement for it. But I've actually put a toggle switch, spring-loaded toggle switch on there, so I can actually use that to pump the disc brake pressure up, and then apply the handbrake cable while I'm holding the switch to actually get the handbrake to lock on nicely. And once I let go of the switch, the pressure will drop away and it'll just be the park brake holding. It just makes applying the park brake a lot easier, I found. This is the front part of the wheel arch, and this is where I've mounted the actuator unit. I've done this just to keep it out of the dust and the weather, but these things are fairly weatherproof. This is the Hydro Pro one. These are available in Australia. They actually come out of Sydney or Melbourne, I believe. Quite well priced, around the $1,000 mark. You can buy the Elco one, which is about $1,400. It's I believe an air over hydraulic, so it has an air compressor in it. These things are just straight electric motor that pumps up, which is more than adequate for a van my weight. Now, it's just a matter of, they have a swivel fitting here, so you can adjust that to any angle. It'll swing 360 degrees, and you just have a locking nut to lock it in. You can see one of my cabling's coming up through. I just used a 20mm compression gland, and then my -3 bulkhead and a loop of braided hose to go over the pump, just to keep things nice and neat. P-clamped up. Used a HDP Deutsch 4-pin connector just to connect it all up nice and neatly, and it's mounted. So just to keep it, you know, I guess keep things tidy. Hopefully it looks all right. I'll probably put a cover over this just to protect it so I can still use the storage box and not have to worry about things rolling into it and rubbing through stuff it probably shouldn't be. Once I've got all the lines hooked up, it's just a matter of a process of bleeding it. Now you can use and that's the other reason why I've put the toggle switch out on the front of the drawbar there. I can use that breakaway switch wiring to actually bleed the brakes up while I get someone to operate the switch. I can then crack the bleed screws, and then that'll pump through pressure and go from there. This has pretty good instructions when you actually buy the unit, so that's not a problem. It does require, on your power supply, fuse of up to 40 amps depending on how cold or weather you're working it in. So, you know, between 20 and 40, that'll be your choice on what you decide on that. Well, I hope you found that helpful or semi sort of informative to give you an idea on whether you should go down the drum to disc brake conversion. It is quite an expensive exercise. I think in total I've probably getting close to the $3,000 mark by the time I purchased like a new handbrake cable and some eye bolts, and ordered some of the wrong fittings, ended up with some excess fittings. But because of where I live, I just can't run down and the parts store and get stuff, so you just got to live with that fact. What it cost you in a bit extra fittings or versus fuel and time, it's definitely easier to err on the too many bits side of things. But as I said, if you're going to install these things, budget for about $3,000 to $3,500, and possibly more if you're going to pay someone to install it. As I said, the parts are readily available for Elco. This wasn't an issue. It was just hard to find someone who knew or understood what I required to do the job. And working out where you're going to run your brake lines, where you're going to mount your unit, all that sort of stuff will require time and thinking. And obviously, you've got to run wiring to run these things too. So it is slightly more complex than electric over drum, but in general, reliability wise, it's definitely, I think, a lot better. Rather than, we'll see how we go with a follow-up review on this once we have it finished.